Yeah. All right, so I think we're ready to convene the meeting. My name is Aaron Buxbaum. I work with SecureNutrition Knowledge Platform. We're really glad to be co-hosting this alongside the Food Quality Global Solutions Group and the Agriculture GP, as well as the Agribusiness and Value Chains, or is it Value Chains and Agribusiness?
That's good. Agribusiness and Value Chains.
Ag GP. This event is happening in person here in the room, plus online. So I've just got a few last-minute instructions for folks who are joining up online. But just to note, for the question and answer part, I will be monitoring the chat box on the WebEx. So anyone online, please feel free to be typing your questions as they come in. I'll make sure to keep a log of them and then feed them to our chair during the question and answer. Another note, this will be recorded for future viewing. And I think that kind of covers it. The microphone, by the way, is right up here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our chair, Chris Brett, who is a lead agribusiness specialist here at the World Bank and comes with a wealth of private sector ag experience, and so I think is well suited to lead us off today. So please go ahead, Chris.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and it's great to see such a turnout. When we organise a BDL, we never know if there's going to be 10 people, 20 or 30. The only advice is get your sandwiches now, if you're planning to actually eat it. So, firstly, thank you very much for coming. I think this is a really, obviously, important conversation, and I was very privileged to be asked to chair it today. I've got a very strong feeling about this link between agriculture and nutrition. I'm getting a bit older in this game, and I've been working in lots of different places, and it was always a big focus on just agricultural production, getting the smallholders producing, getting the food moving. But now really adding that nutrition and nutritious tag on the food is just so important. But I just wanted to sort of say just a couple of words before we go into the presentation with our visitors, our colleagues. Agricultural supply chains are incredibly complicated. It's not easy to look at an intervention that goes through the whole system. When you look at production, you look at logistics, you look at processing, you look at marketing, you look at branding, all these systems, there's very few companies that are actually growing and taking it all the way through. We're hearing a lot of expressions of farm to fork, but a lot of those companies say that because they could be at the fork end and they're pulling the product through, and they have little interventions along the supply chain. And, when you look at, an agricultural production company, they're very focused on what they do. They could be producing grain, they could be producing vegetables. But the importance of what we're talking about here is how we bring that nexus together through the supply chain, which can be often at the SME processing level or the larger scale processing level. And before I joined the bank, we led I was working for a multinational company, which was involved in very much producing from smallholders, supporting smallholders in production, in cocoa, coffee, cashew, cotton, all these kind of products. But we tried really desperately to link a nutrition tag onto working with smallholders. And it was very hard to help them bolster good quality products. And it's not just about your rice or just about your maize. It's about adding the vegetables, adding the fruits into the supply chain. And it was tremendously complicated. And one of the only successes I had on that was in Nigeria when I actually joined the Sun Alliance, which is part of GAIN. And they gave us very, very good guidance on how to work and encourage SMEs to bring that food together and then sell it back into the communities and work with the community, with the farmers. So really, for the purpose of this discussion, we'll have a presentation which will be led by Daniel Albert, the Senior Manager for the Food and Value Chains of the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, GAIN. Come all the way from Nairobi. So I'm not sure if I can say welcome home. Is Nairobi home or the US?
Depends.
Well,
they're both a bit hot. Yeah.
In this climate, I would rather be in Nairobi at the moment, than warm up there. But you've had a wealth of experience in the private sector, doing a lot of work in the high value chain. So we're looking forward to the presentation. And Jinam?
Exactly.
Welcome. I just want to make sure I get that right. Senior Associate in the Knowledge Leadership again. You'll be helping to support this as well. And you've got a PhD in nutrition and been doing a lot of backstopping work here. So on the presentation is supporting this out. So we'll ask Daniel to present. At the end of the presentation, we find it easier to get the presentation, and then at the end of the presentation, we'll have some comments, and then we'll go into the questions and answers. And I'll go around the room. If I've got my back to you, please do shout, but I'll keep looking around. So I'll hand it over to Daniel and say welcome and try and keep the presentation focused. In terms of not too much time, a half an hour or so is good, and then after that we'll start getting a bit edgy.
I'll move quickly, but I'm happy to be prodded to accelerate even further.
So I will do that.
Okay, good. So, without wasting any more time, this, as we know, is our planet. This is the place that we call home. We currently have something like 7 billion people who live with us on this planet, and we know that by 2050 we can expect a population of almost 10 billion people here. What we also know is that these additional 3 billion people who will join us as our children and our nieces and our nephews and our coworkers will join us more often than not in places like Africa in the developing world, and more often than not in cities than in rural areas. This means that these people will, like us, have jobs, and they will work, and they will take the money that they get from their work, and sorry, this thing has a mind of its own. They will take the money that they get from their work, and they will spend that money on food, and they will become patrons of the food system. In Africa, we know that some 95% of all businesses are small and medium-sized enterprises. This means, of course, that the bulk of those who are transacting food, who are buying, who are selling, who are processing, who are aggregating, are also small and medium-sized enterprises. And if we're going to get anywhere in changing the food system, we will need to work with those small and medium-sized enterprises. Do that. W. Edwards Deming was a smart man. He was a physicist and a management thinker. He's the one who gave us the management cycle of plan, do, check, act. But he also had this quote, that your system is perfectly designed to give you the results that you're getting. And if we think of that in terms of the context of the food system, we look at the results that the food system is giving us, and we ask ourselves, is this really the system that we want? I know that you're all thinking that, there's more to nutrition than food, of course. But I think that in the puzzle of nutrition, the piece of food is probably the largest.
You're fine.
Sorry, that's kind of going by itself. So I think we need to think systematically about this food system and how and whether it's working for us. Some of the results that the food system is currently giving us. In Kenya, 36% of women are overweight or obese. In India, 90% of children don't have access to an appropriate diet. In Pakistan, there are 177,000 children every year under 5 who die as a result of malnutrition. And in Mozambique, some 69% of children between the ages of 6 and 23 months are vitamin A deficient. Those are the results from our system, largely derived from our system. I think we have to ask ourselves whether that's really what we want to be achieving. I think we should refrain from compartmentalizing nutrition in the same way that we think about other problems. We think about malnutrition, we think about malaria, we think about natural disasters. But nutrition, if you accept that it's the result of the foods that we consume, and if you accept that the foods that we consume are largely the result of what the food system is providing for us and how we're behaving with food, malnutrition is different, because malnutrition is the effects of a system that is the result of our human action and our human inaction, that food system that we've created, and I think that we need to take the responsibility for fixing in a way that we can't exactly be held responsible for fixing something like a natural disaster or some act of God. There's a difference between food and feed, which I think we need to bear in mind. Feed provides, you can look at, these are 3 people who are customers of one of our grantees in Mozambique. We can ask ourselves what it is that these customers are thinking as they interact with food and as they make purchasing decisions. Feed, of course, is something that provides sustenance, only physiological food, energy, calories, micronutrients. But food is something that we interact with, something that's part of our culture. It's something that is part of our spirituality, even if you think about the stipulations that our beliefs even place on the way that we interact with food. The private sector has come to understand this. This I found in Nairobi a few weeks ago. I don't know which of the Obamas has said this. I don't think it's Michelle, but I don't know. but someone is supporting KFC. Someone named Obama is supporting KFC in Kenya. And the private sector is very good at reminding us that food is more than just a source of nutrition, it's more than a source of energy. We know that Oreo cookies are wonder-filled. Coca-Cola doesn't say anything about, and not to speak ill of the private sector, but Coca-Cola tells us to open happiness. McDonald's tells us, I'm loving it, and that's okay. And that, like Obama is speaking to our beliefs, the food system and the private sector food industry also knows that we make decisions based on more than simply the rational reasons, but also on our beliefs and on our aspirations and on these ways in which food interacts with our psychology. In the United States, a number of years ago, a company was called Bolthouse Farms. They became very successful by marketing baby carrots as in the way that junk food is marketed, and they didn't waste any time coming up with a clever way in which to market that. They simply said, eat them like junk food, and people did, and people still do. And I think that this could be, a model for us, perhaps, in the way that we encourage businesses around the world to interact with consumers and their food choices. Here again, we see comparison of something that really exists in the food industry and something that doesn't quite exist in the world of nutritious food, and that is that we market food not as food, but as a source of joy, or as a source of strength, or as a source of fitness, or as a source of aspiration. We could do the same with nutritious foods, and I think we would be wise to spend more time and energy doing that. At GAIN, we've identified 3 key components to making nutritious food more available and to increase its uptake around the world. Those are access, demand, and addressing the conditions of the enabling environment. And we believe strongly enough in that we are currently restructuring the organization to address those 3 issues. Access, I think, is simple, and the marketplace for nutritious foods that we'll talk about is an intervention that very clearly intersects with that aspect. But creating demand for nutritious foods is also important, and creating demand is more than simply telling people what's good for them, but also making sure that these foods address their psychological and aspirational needs and their lifestyles. And then the enabling environment. We see so often that companies who are producing nutritious foods face real constraints and real difficulties in doing what they're doing and in what they're doing to what they're trying to do well. It's difficult when a company decides to have a certified product and then has difficulty finding a laboratory or having access to the services that they require to be able to certify that food. On to the marketplace. The marketplace for nutritious foods is a project that we began with USAID funding in 2012. It was conceptualized between GAIN and USAID. The project is really focused on helping small and medium-sized enterprises address the constraints that they so often face. Those constraints are financial. Companies need money, of course, to be able to do things and to improve their production capacity and capabilities. But there are also constraints in terms of know-how and business planning and food quality, food safety, production technologies, and those kinds of things that companies struggle to find access to and to be able to afford. There are 2 principal components to the project. The first of those is the Innovation Accelerator. This is a grants-making program through which, to date, we've supported a portfolio of over 60 companies, and we've supported them with over $4 million in grant funding and technical assistance to help them scale up their innovations across 4 countries, so Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Mozambique. Here you see a few examples of them from these various countries and the businesses that they're undertaking. The system works like this. We base our support on the proposals that we receive from companies. So companies will come to us and say, I have an idea, I'm responding to a call for proposals, I would like support from this program for my business. We screen the proposal, evaluate it, and then take that forward to a technical advisory committee in which we assemble a nutritionist and an agribusiness expert and other people from within and outside the organization to help evaluate that idea and its likelihood for success. That evaluation being complete, shortlisted companies are provided with technical assistance for business planning, for product development, to help them vet and document the idea that they've come up with. That business plan and those technical documents are then forwarded to an investment committee, which will then evaluate and decide whether or not that company and that concept merit investment. If that investment decision is positive, then the company will receive grant funding for the capital that they require, as well as for the technical assistance to further that concept. In addition to that, so that was the Innovation Accelerator, the grants making program, and then this is the Community of Practice, where we assemble companies and where we begin the dialogue around nutritious foods. This one happened in Mozambique, where we have 5 of these communities. In Tanzania, there were 3, and then 1 each in Kenya and Rwanda. The first challenge when you deal with small and medium-sized enterprises in discussing nutrition is that people don't really know what nutrition is. People don't really understand the interaction between food and therefore nutrition. So that's where we start with the conversation. But then through the Community of Practice, we were able to assemble businesses, academia, government agencies, other development organizations, and anyone who's interested in furthering that discussion. And then through the Community of Practice, we also provide technical assistance through trainings and the like. A few quick examples of some of the companies that we've been supporting over time. This is a company in Chimoio in Mozambique called Vegman. So we supported Vegman, who already had a plot of land, to modernize, to put in a greenhouse, to electrify the pumping and the irrigation system, and then to refurbish and establish this retail location. So he's selling retail and wholesale from this facility. Sirocco Dairies is a company in Kenya. The company sells milk through an ATM kind of model, so you can bring your own container, and you bring however many coins you want to stick into the thing, and it will spit out the quantity of milk that you purchased. So you're paying only the quantity that you want, and you're not paying for packaging, because you can bring your own, or you can borrow a cup as well. And similar model is Chicken Choice in Kenya. This is in Nairobi. Chicken Choice is selling all the kinds of chicken that you could possibly want or not want to buy. You see their back, legs, feet, liver, gizzards. But that makes these different meats available to people, and because he's willing to sell, the entrepreneur is willing to sell in any quantity that you want to buy, it makes chicken available to those who previously would only have been able to purchase either the whole chicken and then slaughter and consume the thing at once, or nothing at all. That's what I have to say on the project. I think Janan will take over and tell us how effective it's been and what we've seen as a result of the assessment.
Wonderful. So we conducted a series of case study assessments, in part to understand what the contribution of the Marketplace for Nutritious Foods program has been to market food environments, but also primarily to understand and try and develop ways in which we can measure the impact of these types of interventions. So we can clearly monitor production, and we have clear indicators and metrics of nutrition and health, but there's nothing really in between that gives us a sense of how markets are changing, or the foods and the quality of foods available in markets are changing. So before I dive into the methods and the case studies, I want to highlight a couple of challenges for research and evaluation that we tried to overcome. So there's few interventions engaging small and medium enterprises with a specific aim of improving access to nutritious foods. So there's been increased consensus in our community that it's important for us to invest in nutrition-sensitive interventions in addition to nutrition-specific interventions. And there's been a lot of good work done, more so on the production of nutritious foods, and to some extent linking farmers to markets. But there's been less work done specifically trying to change the market food environment and the foods that people have access to in a specific market. As a result, there's not a clear framework for us to measure the impact of interventions like the Marketplace, which I've abbreviated here as MNF. So a recent FAO publication compiled indicators for nutrition-sensitive agriculture and found that there was a clear gap around measuring the food environment. Studies of the food environment have been done mostly in developed countries, so there's not much adaptation to low-income contexts. And a lot of the traditional methods that we use for impact evaluation do not apply in the context of these more complex supply chain interventions. So population-based studies or randomization of the intervention or the intervention markets is something that's not feasible in this context. So it's important for us to try and elaborate and develop these methods for two main reasons. We need to understand how markets and the foods available in them influence human health and nutrition, because ultimately that is our goal collectively is to improve human health and nutrition. And of course, we want to be able to understand our ability to positively modify those environments. So we had two sets of research questions, one around the food environment, trying to develop measures appropriate to assess it, and in doing so to understand the contribution of the marketplace to date. So everything I'll show you today is cross-sectional and pretty exploratory in nature. We had a second objective around learning about private sector engagement, the barriers that SMEs face, and the extent to which the intervention is able to address those. But for the purpose of today's conversation, I'll focus on the former. So just a bit of background about the food environment. It's defined by the Food Environment Working Group as the interface that mediates one's food acquisition and consumption within the wider food system. And they've got this great graphic, which shows the food environment here in this white box in the larger context of the food system. It builds on existing concepts of food security and encompasses both personal and external factors, including the availability, affordability, desirability, and convenience of food. And we've highlighted these four because they were the most relevant to the assessment of the marketplace for nutritious foods. And I'll just note that the MNF program explicitly aimed to improve availability and affordability, but we felt it was also important to look at desirability and convenience as those are factors that influence consumer food choice. So we tried to build on this and focus specifically on the market food environment, and we've defined it as the dynamic system that both governs the delivery of food into markets and creates a context in which consumers interact with the purchased food. So So I've overlaid a red oval on the pieces of the wider food system that are of interest for the market environment. So here I'm just showing a generic production value chain, and we posit that collecting data at each point of the value chain systematically allows for a more complete measurement of these different aspects of the food environment: availability, affordability, desirability, and convenience. And we propose to do this using four methods: consumer surveys, market and trader surveys, in-depth interviews with consumers and vendors, as well as value chain analysis or market mapping. And this final method consists in snowballing of interviews from a supplier, sampling a number of that supplier's processors, interviewing them, sampling a number of the wholesalers that they sell to, interviewing them, and so on and so forth. And the purpose of this is really to try and understand where products flow in space, how their availability changes and in what markets, and also to understand the value added at each level of the value chain. So we applied that measurement framework in the case of 5 business case studies, and we identified intervention markets where we knew that the products were sold, and comparison markets, which were matched for size, foot traffic, distance to main markets, and compared these 4 methods in the 2. So I'll give you a brief overview of the 5 cases, and then I'll highlight some results from each of them. So Daniel talked a little bit about Sirocco, which is a business in Eldoret, Kenya, that aggregates milk from smallholder farmers, and historically sold it to large wholesalers. With the support of the marketplace, Sirocco began pasteurizing its own milk and selling them directly through these milk ATMs in areas of Eldoret accessed by low-income consumers, so some suburban, peri-urban markets. Pioneer is an aquaculture company located near Kisumu, Kenya, that produces high-quality fish fingerlings. And with the support of the marketplace, invested some of their own funds and received grant funding to begin the production of full-size fish, as well as small, pretty affordable fish, small kadogo. So tilapia is a fish that's highly desirable in this area, but that is beginning to disappear and is not affordable for a lot of consumers. Trabac is an egg farm located in Rusine, Rwanda, about 45 minutes out of town. They received funding to modernize their facility and to invested their own funds to increase the size of their flock. So they about doubled the size of their flock and recently began selling eggs. In Mozambique, Alvis is a company that produces affordable meat products for the low-income markets, and Vegman is a large-scale vegetable farm, as Daniel mentioned. So before I move on to the results, I just want to highlight that the marketplace was successful in increasing the production capacity of all of these businesses. We saw clear increases in production and reductions in the production costs of the products, but wanted to investigate further to see how that translated to availability and affordability. So here's a summary of the findings. On the left-hand side, you can see in the gray boxes the names of the businesses, and on the right, we've color-coded the quote-unquote impact of the project on availability, affordability, desirability, and convenience. Green means positive findings and attribute, and the yellow shows areas where improvement is needed. So I will dive in and pull out just some interesting narratives for each of these. So starting with Sirocco, as I mentioned, they increased their production capacity, the volume of milk that they're selling through their milk ATMs. We looked at, quite simply, the prices of milk in our intervention and comparison markets, and we found the milk sold by Sirocco is cheaper. Prices for milk in Eldoret vary from 60 to 75 Kenyan shillings. But we wanted to dig in a little bit deeper to understand whether these reductions in prices were sustainable or just a result of the grant. So we looked at Sirocco's production value chain and compared that to a competitor value chain that is selling milk at the same price. So what you're looking at the top is Sirocco's cost of production and bringing to market, and at the bottom is a competitor that is selling, again, milk at the same price. And what I want to highlight is that the competitor value chain is longer, the prices paid to farmers are less, and that the margins for Sirocco are higher. So that tells us that Sirocco offers higher prices to farmers and better margins, and that tells us that the price that they're offering is favorable for them and quite sustainable. The margins that they get by selling directly to consumers at their retail locations are substantially higher than the margins that they received when they were selling wholesale. So that gives us confidence that the grant was able to accelerate this business and make milk more affordable. Consumers also feel that milk is more affordable to them in the intervention markets. So in the rainy season, milk is seen as highly affordable when it's available in both intervention and control markets. And when we look at the dry season, generally we see reductions in perceptions of affordability, but less so in the intervention market. So it seems that there's a seasonal kind of smoothing in the perceived affordability in the intervention market. And vendor surveys helped corroborate this and gave us some added insight. So here we're looking at the bottom graph that shows the average volume sold per vendor by season. And we see that pasteurized milk kind of tides over milk availability in the dry season. And that's in part because the price of pasteurized milk is similar to the price of raw milk in the dry season when it's scarce. And there's also a quite salient fear of milk adulteration for hawked milk, which is the alternative. Just briefly want to touch on desirability and convenience. What I'm showing you here is the factors that drive consumer choice for milk by different population segments. Consumers at point of sale, in our intervention and comparison markets, ATMs, different sources of milk. But the takeaway here is that the blue bar is the biggest, and that for all different types of consumers, freshness is what drives consumer choice, which is interesting to know, and is a key characteristic of pasteurized milk, which is sold cold. We found that overall, raw milk is still preferred. It's the preferred milk in the intervention and in the comparison market. People prefer it because it's creamy. But in the intervention market, you do see higher preference for pasteurized milk than in the comparison market. And ATM milk is highly convenient. You also see that they purchase this pasteurized ATM milk more frequently than consumers in the control market, in the comparison market, excuse me. And the convenience is because of the cold temperature of the milk as well as the small amount of milk that one can purchase. So this is just a quote from one of our interviewees showing the convenience of the milk because it's cold and it saves her a trip. So that was the case of Sirocco. Moving on, I want to hone in on the cage farmers in Kenya, tilapia, and I'll show some results on availability and affordability there. So just as a reminder, Pioneer did not sell fish directly at all prior to working with the marketplace, and has a production capacity of about 4 tons of fish currently. So here we're looking at the distribution model of Pioneer's fish. About 20% of those 4 tons goes to retailers nearby in the Kisumu area in kind of local markets, again, urban but pretty low income, and 70% by weight go to Nairobi. The fish that is sold locally in Kisumu is largely the small-sized tilapia, the kadogo, at a pretty competitive price. These are sold at 42 Kenyan shillings per unit compared to about 70 in markets. The full-size tilapia runs for about 200 Kenyan shillings and is largely exported. So while the prices are pretty competitive for consumers in the area, the margins on this small tilapia are very small. The margins on its larger tilapia that's exported are much higher. So while these move very quickly, he's able to sell the fish at a higher rate and is able to produce these more quickly than the full-size tilapia. The viability of this business really rests on coupling this high-margin product with this low-margin product. So we had color-coded this as kind of needs improvement because the extent to which this low price will remain is a question. Consumers in the intervention markets also perceive this fish to be more available, which is interesting to note, that in addition to looking at production volume, people actually perceive that. And again, it's seasonal. So in the intervention market, we're seeing consumers perceive higher availability in the dry season when fish is less available. And they also perceived greater increases compared to the previous year. And I'll end with a couple of findings from Trabak, the large-scale egg producer in Rwanda. I'll note here as well that the project is much younger in Rwanda, and they had recently received funding. So Trabak had plans to install 3 kind of retail locations in the area nearby its farm, which again are more low-income and less urban. But at the time of the assessment, that had not yet happened, so it was a bit early. I'll show you Trabak's distribution model. So what we're seeing here is that most of Trabak's eggs are actually sold to markets outside of the area, so in Kigali and exported to the DRC, so markets that offer a much better price for those eggs. About 25% of its produce is sold nearby. So on the right, we're showing you a map of Trabak's distribution model. So again, by interviewing all of those actors along the supply chain, we were able to see that a small portion goes nearby here, and the vast majority is being exported here. And just to note that eggs that are sold nearby are all sold at about 100 Rwandan francs per unit. Whether they're purchased from Trabak at a lower price, who's able to produce eggs less expensively as a result of the grant, or elsewhere. So the gains there are really to the middleman or the retailer. And that's in large part because eggs don't have a discernible feature that consumers kind of discern upon. So in summary, we saw that support to SMEs was successful in increasing the production and reducing the production costs of nutritious foods, and the extent to which this translates to lower prices really varied. Lower prices and more availability really varied in our sample. We noticed that MNF grantee businesses that operate at retail tended to have more control over their prices and were able to pass on lower prices to their consumers, as in the case of Sirocco. Small serving sizes or specific target product lines targeting low-income consumers were the most successful in increasing availability and affordability for that group. So thinking of Pioneer that sold a small fish, or Sirocco again that sold a small, very convenient amount of milk. And where prices are lowered, sustainability of those lower prices should be considered, as we saw in the case of the fish. I didn't touch on this, but I wanted to bring it up because the proximity of retail location emerged systematically in all 5 cases as the main factor that determines where consumers are buying their foods. So that's something definitely to consider when working with small and medium enterprises. And we noted that seasonality played a significant role in determining availability and affordability in our sample of 5. Just briefly, some methodological considerations to note. We found that the market food environment was a useful framework to guide the assessment of these types of interventions. Of course, we want to do this longitudinally, but that's to note. And a measurement framework that guides data collection really at every level, consumer, vendor, market, And triangulating findings was useful and provided actionable insights on the project. And finally, the identification of appropriate counterfactuals to attribute causality is a real barrier for this type of research. So businesses are inherently dynamic in nature. It's very difficult to predict a priori which markets they're going to be selling their foods in, and as a result, finding a counterfactual is an inherent limitation of this type of research. So while combining all types of data was helpful in strengthening this analysis, there's a need for us to develop modeling methods, perhaps, that don't rely on a counterfactual as much. I'll leave you with just 3 conclusions. One is that the private sector, in part, shapes the foods that people have access to. Whether we, as the nutrition community, want to engage with them or not, that is a reality. Supporting SMEs to produce nutritious foods does have the potential to improve market food environments, as I showed in our 5 case studies. And in this era of sustainable development and as diets transition, we must continue to identify ways to engage with the private sector and to develop measures to assess the impact of those types of interventions. And with that, I would like to thank all of our program team and also the technical advisory group that provided significant input into the methods. And we're happy to take questions.
Great, thank you very much. I've never seen an ATM that dispenses milk. I thought, yeah, it's cool, and it is cool as well, because the milk's cold, isn't it? I thought that was an amazing intervention, actually, and innovation. I think that's really something that we should sort of consider, particularly in the bank operations as we go forward, because you can't get it more convenient than walking up to an ATM and just extracting milk. But anyway, so my first question, actually, I was reading the paperwork, and the wording gets a little bit mixed for me between grants and support. I just want to ask that question, that when you give a grant, these are SMEs, they're businesses. The grant is a great way of accelerating, kickstarting that business. When you do your evaluation, do you look at the amount of money you've invested as a grant? Because obviously there's different amounts that go in there. I'm just trying to work out, that sustainability factor, that if you put a grant in, it gets the business growing. As long as the business model was sound, and that grant is an intervention to kickstart that incubation and get it going. So I just want to ask you that question. The grant's obviously important, but do you allow for that in when you're looking at the costings across the supply chain? You do the competitive analysis. How does that sort of affect? Okay?
That's a great question. We did not. So we looked at metrics of business health and growth to date, but we have not yet modeled the impact of the grant further down the line, which is something that's important to do, because obviously the gains of the intervention are not over a period of 3 or 4 years. The businesses are self-sustaining, and so capturing that kind of longer-term impact is something that's important. But we didn't.
Okay. Obviously, we didn't talk much about the role of the government there, but I won't bring that into my conversation yet. I just want to now open up. Have any questions to anyone in the audience? I mean, a lot of experience there? Oh, my God. I'll start here. So if you could just give your name and who you work for.
Great. Emmy Simmons, Global Channel on Ag and Food for Nutrition. And one of the questions I think that relates to your question about grants is, where did the entrepreneurs find the technical assistance? Did GAIN provide that, or did they go into the local market for business consultants to help them set up their models, get their margins right?
We just take one more question down this side, and then we'll bucket them. Will there someone else just here?
So, 2 things that I would like to get your additional information. The first is, I understand that it's the SMEs that come with the proposal, but to what extent the work is driven by the actual nutrition problem on the ground? So say the region has an anemia problem for women. To what extent the proposals you try to develop, or if somebody presents a proposal, you try to work on that problem versus just be completely demand-driven? And the second is, on the market, you mentioned at the beginning that it's very difficult to, or haven't been found a measure of the marketplace in terms of nutrition situation of different markets, foods being offered. Why is it that there's no index that could be built similar to the food desert index for urban areas, where one can take both price as well as types of foods available at the market and build an index to try to drive interventions based how diverse the food market or
Good. Okay, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. So the first question was the technical assistance. How that works generally is when we identify with the companies that there's a need for the technical assistance, which typically happens during the technical advisory meeting. So we might be evaluating the proposal, and someone will say, hey, this guy needs some marketing assistance, or this is a fish farm and it needs technical assistance from an aquaculture expert. What we would do then is discuss that need with the entrepreneur and then develop some terms of reference and then tender that assistance within the country. But that tendering process would happen. We would do that as game, and then we would discuss the proposals with the company, and then we would discuss the eventual scope of work with the company as well. So they need to be on board to make sure that we and they and the company who's providing, or the individual who's providing that support, all agree on what's going to be delivered to the company as support to that.
So pretty hands-on.
It's pretty hands-on and it's pretty time-consuming. I think that's what it takes to make it happen.
And you pay for that assistance?
That's
part of the grant?
Okay. Yeah.
And to Diego's?
Yeah. So then the question around how, whether it's demand-driven or whether we attempt to address nutrition needs specifically, we don't seed ideas, and we don't, I think, force anyone to do anything that they wouldn't otherwise be involved in. But when we evaluate the proposals that we receive, we address which kind of food is this, what is the micronutrient content, what need would this be addressing for this population, and should we therefore support it as part of the nutrition criteria of the evaluation, alongside what are the capabilities of the entrepreneur, what is the strength of the business concept, how successful is this likely to be. And then your last question on the index, that's something actually that we are mulling around and I think thinking about, because we also see that there's real difficulties that companies face, and those difficulties are systemic. So what we're able to accomplish with a project like this is we're able to address particular concerns or particular problems for an individual company. But those systemic things, like how long does it take to certify a product in this country? How many days do I have to wait for laboratory analysis of these inputs? All those things are things that they affect everyone. And we often see that companies who are doing their best to produce nutritious foods, safe foods, are at some kind of disadvantage because they end up having to pay for registration, having to pay for certification. They're the ones who try to pay tax. And someone who operates kind of under the table without regard to those requirements is at an advantage because that person can just kind of do what they want. So it's something that has our attention. And I think there's no shortage of recognition that idea needs to happen. We would need funding to make it a reality.
I'll just do a couple more questions in the room and then we'll check on that.
Can I just quickly speak
to
your point as well? I think the point you mentioned about the index is a very good one, and I know there's some good work being done by folks at IANDA to try and elaborate on that. The World Food Program does monitor the prices of certain foods in markets, what we try to leverage. Unfortunately, it's not granular enough that it goes to a specific food, so it's not necessarily super appropriate for the evaluation of a specific intervention. But I do agree that type of monitoring needs to happen longitudinally in countries for us to understand how market food environments are changing and what the impact is on consumer choice.
On the table here, we'll ask here and then we'll go down here.
Just a question, maybe I didn't understand. How do you define market? That's the question. So that you can actually compare them? Because that wasn't clear to me. That's one thing. And the second thing is the way you describe your supply chain. I think for the sake of understanding better how the value chain works, you would separate primary production and processing. And most of the companies that you're working with are primary production. Milk, there is pasteurization, but it's basically almost primary. Fish, that's primary production. Meat, that's primary production. Vegetables, that's primary production. And the second one that is secondary production is the meat company that wasn't doing well. And it's very interesting because usually when you do the further down the processing line you go, and the most complicated it gets to, at the same time, provide something that is affordable, that tastes good, And that's what you see in the thing. So those are two different sets of issues. Those do not address the same type of consumers. And that's a comment, by me putting all of them on the same level, you're not having enough granularity into maybe where you should focus to begin with your
We'll just take one more question, is that all right?
It's related to that question.
Oh, okay.
I'm Lidan Du. I'm one of the helpers on the.
Are you answering the question or making a question?
No, it's a similar question following along the question, because we did encounter those challenges on how do you categorize businesses and how do you measure them, because there are a mixed bag of different things.
Yeah.
Some are primary producers, some are processors, more aggregator, or even distributors. So I'm glad that Gain took approach to come down to the case study level, so that gives some of the qualitative details. But on a quantitative, I do agree there seems to be a lack of more detailed matrix system to track on a different link of the value chain. How are you going to categorize or measure quantitatively those intermediate indicators to track the successes or the failures, relatively speaking, of those businesses? And I think looking at how the businesses keeping their record on whether they're making it or are they seeing the increase of the numbers of customers, those on the supply side of assessment could be useful complement to what you have come up with. Seems to be more qualitative. So that would be my question and suggestion.
Have you got any replies there?
Yeah, so I guess there was a question about how we're defining markets, and I think that's a great question. We took a very simple approach. We identified the retail locations of our businesses, and we're talking about markets as physical spaces within which those retail locations are located.
So how far? Or, I mean, is it a question of piece number? I mean, what's...
Yeah, locations where there were an aggregated number of vendors selling goods. That's as granular as we got. We didn't encounter too many markets that we sampled from that were very sprawling, where it was unclear kind of where the market was or where the market was not.
So is market like marketplace or market?
Like the physical space.
The physical space.
Yes, that's how we defined it. And I think your comments, both of your comments on the kind of segmentation of producers versus processors is very well received. So this work, again, was exploratory, and I think that something that came out in terms of looking at the results is that there was a clear difference in impacting availability and affordability based on the distribution model. So I think that's the way that we've categorized it, but it's nice to hear the language from perhaps an economist or someone who works in the value chain field, because we definitely saw differences there. Where there was kind of primary production of eggs or vegetables, the margins were, the savings were absorbed by the next person on the value chain. And where we had kind of a more direct retail location of people processing food, we were more successful. So that's what we received.
Okay. Can I just check with Aaron? Is there anyone there?
Yeah.
Do you want to read out a couple of questions, then we'll come back to the table and others.
So the two questions that I've seen come in so far, first was from Harley Stokes, asking if the team from the Innovation Accelerator provides feedback for those who do not pass the review. And then from Dick Tinsley, asking about how you defined and determined affordability.
So I can tell you the answer to that question, and usually we get that question from people who have submitted proposals and then aren't successful. But the answer to that question is no, we do not, for the same reason that when you don't get selected for a job interview, nobody tells you why you didn't get the job. It's very difficult for us to say, that something is wrong with the company, and that's not why we're not selecting ones. We only select companies who are, we take the best of the ideas that we're able to select, and those are the ones who get support. But we don't want to criticize or tell anyone that they should be doing something differently, especially if there are further rounds of proposals in which those things will be addressed in the proposal with the expectation that they'll be supported. So unfortunately, we don't.
The other question on affordability?
Yeah, on affordability, it's a slippery concept, but again, we tried to triangulate. We looked at prices of the specific foods we were supporting versus either the status quo food, a comparable food, or the exact same food. We looked at the proportion of low-income consumers who were purchasing the marketplace-supported food in the intervention market versus the control market, comparison market, to see if there was any difference there. And we also use just perception-based measures of affordability by asking consumers and then ranking that on a Likert, like a 5-point Likert scale.
Okay, let's have two more. Ira first, and then Michelle. So then I'm going to go this way, and I'll come back. I've got to be fair.
I was just wondering whether there were any auxiliary services taking place in the intervention areas or markets where you operated, whether there are any nutrition awareness campaigns, there's also behavior education that was taking place from any actor that affected consumption, and whether you saw increases or changes in food consumption of products.
And do you want to identify yourself?
No. Yes. So thank you for the presentation. I'm mostly interested in both the project, but also the evaluation part. So how do you split your comparison group? And I mean, I can totally imagine how hard it must be to find a counterfactual. And also, did you have enough sample size in the comparison group to sort of make the before and after comparison that you did? And if so, I'll be curious to see if were there any spillover effect in the sense that, well, the business that got the grant, they had some sort of, they had some sort of hands-on. Do other businesses also sort of learn from that? And so could you have expected that some of that knowledge would have gone into the comparison group, which would affect the results?
Yeah. So I'm happy to speak to those quickly, Daniel. In terms of behavior change, communication campaigns, or anything on the demand side, I don't think that we specifically linked with those. The extent to which they're happening, I'm not sure as well. But that is something that we're looking to explore in the next iteration of the marketplace. And we did not measure down to consumption specifically because we did not do any demand creation activities. So the outcomes of the interventions are at the market level, because again, we did not intervene at all on kind of factors that would drive consumer food choice. But I think it would be interesting and logical to look at that in the next iteration. On the comparison markets, what we did is we identified the quote-unquote intervention markets and then kind of did a mapping exercise to understand what other physical retail locations were within the same area. And we tried to match them as much as possible so that they were similar in terms of foot traffic, how far it is from the main CBD area, the demographic characteristics. And in terms of sample size, we didn't have any issues meeting our quota. Our sample size was about 200 per market. And whether we have enough power to find statistical differences in our two groups is difficult to know, because there's no real observed variability in our outcomes of interest that we could have used for the power calculation. And on the copycat businesses or the spillover effects, we did observe a little bit of that, or thought that might be the case in the case of Sirocco, the milk ATM, because at the time of the intervention, there was one other. Today, there's over 22. And I think that's in large part because of things that are happening in Kenya and the outlawing of hot milk, but it may also be in part because of the success of Sirocco. It's very hard to get at. We tried to look at that qualitatively. But they do supply milk to 3 other ATMs in the area, so there's some onward selling. But again, very hard to quantify.
Any questions on the maximum then? Okay, we'll come to you at next one.
Okay, I'm Fawn, and I work with Agriculture Global Practice. I have a small question, because when I see the nutritious food environment, I also want to see like food safety and quality control, because when you like set up the ATM for like milk, I also wonder how to mitigate the risk of food contamination. And if you measure like food nutritious environment, would you also measure the food safety side and the food quality side? Thank you.
I'm Hannah Gadenay for Agribusiness Systems International. Just 2 quick questions. One on the pricing, so the milk being cheaper. And did you find any problems in terms of quality or perception of quality of it being a cheaper price? I work with vitamin A maize in Zambia, and we actually chose not to price it lower than white maize because of perceived poor quality. So I didn't know if you ran across that in terms of the pricing of the nutritious foods. And second question, you mentioned, and I know that there's community of practice. I'm just curious how those community practices are functioning, and if that's, for those that don't get accepted, for example, is the community of practice proving to be a place where they can receive further support? Because I know that was in the initial design of the marketplace.
Yes, let me speak to the first and the third one, and then you can handle the second one. The first question around food safety, quality control, how are we handling that? generally, again, as part of the technical advisory committee, if the concept involves something that would require food safety considerations, hazard analysis, or whatever, then we would prescribe at that point the support that the company needs to be able to meet those requirements. So it's a consideration, and it's something that we address through technical assistance to the companies. And then on the community of practice and that kind of support, yes, we use the community of practice not only as the convening place, but also as an outlet for training, short-term support, sometimes group trainings on various business-related or food-related issues. And we're currently coming up on a new iteration of the marketplace with funding from the Netherlands. And under that, we will expand the community of practice and offer two tiers of support. So one tier will be the general come to a meeting, spend a day with us. That's one thing. And then the next tier would be more in-depth training for 2 days or 3 days or whatever to groups of companies who would benefit from that.
And Hannah, on the pricing, we actually did not observe any kind of negative perceptions around that. The main perception around pasteurized milk is that the cream is skimmed off, because that's oftentimes the case. It's not the case in the case of Sirocco, but that's people's aversion to pasteurized milk. But they see it as like a largely safe and fresh food. So, and I think people are largely aware of the kind of safety benefits of consuming pasteurized milk.
I just want to add one brief side note, and that is that these perceptions we've noticed, we did some work in Rwanda to kind of evaluate people's perceptions around food, and we found there that there was a real preference for things that had been kind of artisanally produced, that people would produce something that was informally produced by their neighbor over something that was tinned and canned and produced by a factory in the city. And I think that that's not necessarily true everywhere, but I think that people's we have to remember that we can't just look at we can't assume that everyone has the same attitude toward food and different kinds of food, but that those beliefs and those perceptions are really probably very particular to different groups of people.
Question, so would the companies that you're working with, these SMEs, do they have access to loans instead of grants?
If they do, then it's not through us.
Could they have had access to it? Was the grant coming in, because you could just provide technical assistance and not the money, the seeding money.
Right.
So the question is, that's to bounce back about on the question of whether you're measuring what the grant has produced, etc., and whether the models are sustainable, etc. The question is, was there opportunity for them to get a loan at the local bank and you providing just technical assistance?
Yeah, can I just make a comment there?
Yeah.
I think the other question, of course, comes from that. When you start it up and it's an SME, would they then build enough business history, credit history, reliability, marketplace to go and get a commercial loan? I think that's, and then really spare us. So just hold that thought.
Or is GAIN and this project looking at the extent to which the grants have actually been gateway grants that impact investors or home sector lenders have been able to come along and increase capital. I mean, I know Chicken Choice in Kenya, and Eric is looking to double his business every year. Well, obviously, if he in fact succeeds at that, he's going to be taking loans or getting impact investors to join him, I would expect. And you could cap that up as a quote.
But that's the whole
A
point.
gateway.
That's all about incubation, isn't it? You start something and you grow.
Yeah.
And when it gets to 20 million, ISD will come in and put money. That's what we can. But we won't go down that route.
20?
30?
Do you want to comment on that?
It's really about the business model, the fundamental business model, because if you targeting SMEs just to keep them SMEs, or
So you want to make a comment in this?
Yeah, I want to rephrase the question. May I ask you, you said nothing about the size of it. Are we looking at tiny macro enterprises, basically small on-farm, off-farm production, or are we looking really at kind of cooperative arrangement where you collect the nuts from various suppliers, farmers in the region, and try to sell this. I wasn't clear what kind of enterprise level you're from.
So it's about the entry point and how you scale. So
Yeah.
What
Yeah,
level
I'll
of
say words
scale-
and let you
what
scale.
level of scale
Or what
are
do
you
you want?
talking?
I'm sure the scale will.
Or whether you wanted to scale, because
Okay.
I'm not sure that in what
So
you're saying, yeah,
Let
the
Daniel come back on
the
that.
scalability is part of the model.
I think just to answer quickly, and Daniel, I think you're probably better placed to elaborate, but there's a spectrum. So some of them are larger, like Sirocco. This is a sample of 5. Sirocco is pretty large. Their network is 3,800 farmers, and that's in contrast to someone like Pioneer that employs, I think now, five people. So in terms of whether or not they're able to access loans, what we found from our business level assessment is that that also varied. In the case of Mozambique, with the economic crisis, it's extremely hard for businesses to access loans, and the terms are not favorable. Some of the businesses are small in size and are not very competitive for commercial loans. So in some sense, we would hope that the marketplace would, like you mentioned, kind of make them a little bit more investor-ready or investor-friendly and propel them. We did not find in our sample of just 36 that we looked at in the business assessment that businesses leveraged additional funding, and that may be in part be because there's not a lot of funding available for them. But I don't know about the larger portfolio of 60, et cetera.
We do have some cases of companies who have gone and gotten, been able to procure their own financing from banks on the back of the work that we've done with them and on the back of the business plans that were created, and then the support that was done to bring them up to the stage that they're at now. I do think that it's a stepwise process, and I don't think that getting loans would have been easy for many of the companies that we had been dealing with at the point at which we came in to support them, which was like 3 years ago, basically. So what I think is that if you had a longer project after, if you could spend 3 years taking this idea and this concept and this entrepreneur and providing a bit of de-risking capital to help them begin and to help them prove the concept, and then at this point now, 3 years later, to be able to go in and bring in actual debt, I think that would work better. But again, loans are so expensive for many of these companies that the profit margins on what they would be procuring would have to be very high for them to be able to accomplish success in that way. And I think
So
that's
Sirocco has supplied 3 other companies. I mean, if you keep growing, is the business model for them to open others, or is it because, I mean, if you say the loans are very expensive, then you're going to sell. Because that means that the next step is also going to be a grant because...
well. No, I don't think. Yeah, no, I think the idea is for them to scale. So we've seen, for example, for Eric, he started with something like 9 of these franchises when he began, and now he has over 15 around Nairobi. And we've seen him through the support that we will provide, and I think now he will go and leverage his own capital to be able to expand further. And I think that's a success. We have another company in Kenya producing dairy products, and they too, on the back of the initial support and the capital improvements that were made, have been able to go and procure their own loan. And
are you in the situation where you're given 2 grants for the same organisation? You grant, it gets going, and then you give another grant? I'm just trying to work out where the entry-exit point is.
yeah,
At the end of the day, I think it's so important to get things going. It's a question of where do you say, right now you've got to be economically viable on your own.
yeah, we have not.
Yeah. Right, any other questions besides finance? Or I mean, obviously it's a big thing. It's all about money.
Yeah.
Can I say something on
I
the
want to
scaling?
brain
So,
delay.
we're having a lot of discussions about this right now. I'm Lynette Neufeld. I'm the head of the team that runs assessment in games. And we're having a lot of discussions right now with the marketplace team and management about what is the model scale of something like this. And I think we haven't come to our final conclusion, but I think the direction that we're going is that there has to be, it's a dynamic and diverse portfolio, and there has to be multiple routes to scale. One being something like Chicken Choice, where by the nature of the business and the dynamism of the entrepreneur, they will have access to credit, they will be able to grow that business, and that, for that business, that's a model to scale. But others might be in Sirocco. It seems like we can't claim attribution to that, but it seems like it's such a creative idea that naturally there is a growing of that. And whether that results in gains investment, we'll never know that, but it might be, at least in part. But others might just be more companies coming in and more companies going from they're very small to slightly bigger. And I think what our vision is that the scale of such a program of this nature cannot be one single model and everything is going to go down that route. That would be limiting the potential of this kind of a program, and it would be naive to the realities of how businesses work and how food gets into the system and you know the context in which we're working and the diversity of the context, frankly, in which we're working.
Can I just ask you another question? Also, we talk a lot about private sector and how we're working here. Do you do a lot of advocacy with governments as well? I don't know how you connect with governments, or is there no connection?
Somewhere in between no and a lot. We don't do advocacy with this project, and the reason that we don't is because we have so many different needs and so many different constraints that each company faces. We're really focused on supporting individual enterprises with their own business models and their own individual success. And the budget of the project also doesn't allow us to engage in advocacy. But we do work with governments in different ways. So we would work with them to help foster the links between the companies and those who are certifying or regulating the products. If there is a private sector association or a government agency around supporting small and medium enterprises, then we would link with them and connect with them, and then align our support to their initiatives as well.
Any other questions?
But I do want to come back to, I think, sorry, can I make one more comment?
Yeah, and then
I think
we'll go to the WebEx quickly, and then we'll go to the blog.
I do think to address the issue of scale and the knowledge that we generate from this process, it's very important that we capitalize on all these lessons that we learn through these individual businesses and case studies, and that we take that knowledge and use that as one of the additional means to scale in order to affect policy change through probably some broader and different intervention.
Aaron, do you want to read out a couple of questions?
Sure. Thank you. So one kind of on the program setup, and then one that gets a little bit back towards nutrition. The first from Melissa, if you were to generalize across applicants, what do you think were the biggest challenges? Were they around demand creation, supply, production, accounting? Like, what were kind of the business challenges you saw? And then if you were sort of a hypothetical, if you were to sort of turn around, I guess the entry point for the program, like you've started thinking about income or family size or things of that nature, how do you think that you might prioritize sort of what companies you took into the program if you're looking more from like a family nutrition perspective?
Okay, do you want to take those two, and we'll have them all in the
Yeah, I think on the second question, looking back at the end consumers that we're trying to reach, I don't think that the profile of businesses that we have supported is a bad one at all in terms of the production of their foods and their reach to low-income consumers. I think to further our reach to those consumers, we might want to think a little bit more deliberately about our distribution channels, making sure that retail locations are in areas that are accessible to those consumers, so that the gains are to them and not necessarily to other actors on the value chain.
The challenges are many, and they really depend on the company that you're dealing with. Some companies really struggle with simple business management things. I mean, accounting can be difficult. Record keeping can be difficult for the smaller companies. But then for the larger ones, there's a real lack of knowledge around quality management, processing technologies, marketing foods, labeling foods, packaging foods. All of these things are things I think that companies struggle with, and the answer to the questions that they have, if they realize that they should have the questions, is something that's not always affordable in the countries that they're working in.
Just one basic question. The dairy on the
That's why the food price are getting higher. Because, bringing in quality food safety costs money. And so just naturally it increases the price. That's why affordability, food safety sometimes don't work together in some countries, especially in countries like Rwanda. That is a logistic nightmare.
I was just going to ask that, for example, on the dairy one, what sort of grant was that? Without the Is that public knowledge, the kind of grant that you did?
It might be, but it's not in my head, so I don't.
Just wanted to know, as an idea.
I don't remember how much it was. It's not a secret.
No, I just wondered, as a grant, to get some sort of idea in my head.
Typically, the grants that we provide are around $100,000.
About 100,000.
Yep.
That's sizable. Sizable. So we got two more. We had a question from my colleague on the back.
Yeah, just wanted to address a comment that's been made a couple of times about the fact that it's difficult or impossible to find counterfactuals for this kind of analysis. And it seems like in the discussion I've heard a lot of places where there'd be possibilities for finding counterfactuals that aren't taken advantage of. So for example, it sounds like how rigorous the evaluation process of grants are, give opportunities. Like, it wouldn't be appropriate to compare all the people who successfully apply with all the people who are rejected. But if there's a really careful process, you know who are the people who just made it and the people who just didn't. You have regression discontinuity methods that let you make comparisons that are close to randomization. Or, for example, using the matching design, if you're taking into account those matching characteristics during analysis, you get much better, closer to causal estimates than just raw comparisons. So I'm wondering if you've thought about these kind of methods of evaluation, or if not, I guess when you mentioned at the end counterfactual methods or causal methods that don't rely on counterfactuals, what kind of methods you're thinking of, and why you think those would be better?
Yeah, definitely. We'd love to do some regression analysis and control for some important confounders. We just have not gotten to that yet. In terms of the other methodology that you mentioned, kind of comparing businesses that just made it and didn't, that would be super neat to explore. I'd love to chat with you a little bit more about that after. And in terms of modeling methods that might skirt the need for a counterfactual, it would be great. I know folks at UJ are looking at ways to model changes in consumer demand in sub-Saharan Africa as a result of changes in availability. So something like that, some modeling that's well-grounded would be extremely useful for us.
Maybe just to round that out a little bit more, this was an exploratory initial assessment. This was not an impact evaluation, and I think it's really important to make that distinction. In this round of the marketplace that's rolling out now, we are going to do an impact evaluation, and we've just brought an economist and expert in impact evaluation methodologies onto the team who will be helping us in exploring all of the proper econometric modeling and every other methodology, and we will definitely be looking at those part of the plan.
We have a question. Sorry. Yeah.
No worries. Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. I'm Anne Wanland. I've been working in Rwanda at the intersection of nutrition and agriculture for almost 3 years now. So I have lots of thoughts on eggs and nutrition.
So you know about it.
I know about it. But I was wondering if you could comment on anything beyond what you've already said about the potential for the businesses that were part of the case studies to have a real impact on nutrition kind of quickly and at scale. What are some of the characteristics that you think would be useful for us to kind of understand about the potential for impact on nutrition?
Yeah, I think the businesses that might be most successful are those that are able to increase their production capacity relatively quickly, and to do so in a way that it's profitable for them to reach low-income consumers specifically, like in the case of Sirocco. That's a win-win situation. The margins are much higher for them to sell directly at their ATMs than to sell wholesale, which is their predominant business model, and it directly targets people who have low kind of cash. In terms of the timeline, I don't think anything is quick in terms of increasing or improving nutrition. It takes some time. So that factor as well.
Is there any more questions? Anything more there, Aaron?
Yeah, there's one more question asking for a clarification on the profit margins of the SMEs that you're working with.
Right to return.
Clarification on the profit margin?
It's just profit. It's looking for the actual kind of profit margins. Is that what it's saying?
Yeah, how thin is the profit margin of the SMEs you're working with, and kind of also going deeper into comparisons between sort of what food costs on the market and what likely local wages are. Yeah, in terms of profitability, I don't know off the top of my head what it looks like across the portfolio.
And, sorry, what was the second piece?
The
Oh, yeah. That's a good question. So I didn't present it, but all of the kind of consumer perception level data did not vary by, if you disaggregate it by income category, the trends are basically the same. We did look at consumer incomes in the area relative to the price points of the products, kind of just qualitatively. And in terms of how affordable that is for consumers, it varied. For the case of Aves, which we didn't delve deep into, the products are quite affordable in the sense that they compare well to other products, similar product lines, but they're sold in large packages, so that reduces kind of low-income consumers' purchasing power. For Vegman, we focus on cabbage and tomatoes, which are pretty much staples, so pretty affordable relative to consumers' income. Sirocco, again, the Sirocco and Pioneer, both the small serving sizes, really helps. And there was no real difference in prices for Trebek.
I just want to come in here and say that at the bank, over the last year, and bank less actually, that we've been doing an awful lot of work looking at the urban food markets and the pricing structures. Because we can all appreciate that in the urban markets, we've got lots of people who are living on $1.50 to $2 a day. And the question is, what is a nutritious diet for that kind of income level of people? And it's so important that we focus on that. The other area that we've been doing on the bank is that we've done an awful lot of work on data collection in agricultural production. We really do that data on agricultural markets, or the urban markets, the change in the urban market. So we've been doing a lot of work on that in the last year, and there's quite a few reports coming out soon from the bank on the urban food systems or the urban consumption and the changes that are happening. Unfortunately, a lot of food that's getting into the marketplace is very cheap, semi-processed food, which has got very little nutritious value. And I think that's why I was asking questions about the role that you're doing, because you're targeting that nutritious role. But we've got to get that learning into the way we're structuring, advising, and working with governments. Because the World Bank clients are the governments, so we have a lot to do there. So really, I mean, I'll bring this to a conclusion now, because I believe other people have this room shortly. So I just wanted to say, have you got a question, or?
I have one point.
One?
I think that's very important what you just said.
Yeah.
And I think the backward linkages into the rural areas will be phenomenal. If you can, or the bank, to the policy capacity, can figure out how to manage that trade-off. Because unless there are incentives that overcome the affordability constraints in these markets, this one is going to have a very hard time.
Yeah. No,
need to basically reduce the incentive to go for the semi-processed cheap food, which we see everywhere.
When we're talking with governments, I'll give Nigeria as an example. Very often they're finding it very hard to move food from the middle or the northern part down into the big townships of Lagos and all those areas. Some of the people are arguing it's cheaper to import. So we have to look at where all the wrong incentives are in the system and the costs. But I mean, we all know those debates, but as I said, there's a lot to do. So I wanted to give a special thanks to the presentation. And I think it's so important to really invest in these models and to really invest in these opportunities and see where they are. So I think the work you're doing is of huge value in those countries, and of course the learning. So we need to get more learnings out of what you're doing so you can help to influence us as well. So in conclusion, can we thank Daniel and the team? Thank you very much. But we have to do a special thanks to Iro, who helped to bring this together, and of course our genius here, Aaron, who's struggled away and kept everything running. Well done, Aaron. Thank you. Okay, so thank you very much, and thanks for coming over as well.